Hey there, how's everything going? If you're starting digging into ASP.NET Core and struggle to fully understand middleware, then stay tuned because this video is really for you. We'll explain what middleware is, how middleware is supposed to work, why middleware order is really important, and how you can create your very own small but fancy custom middleware. So stay tuned. Welcome to Developer Ramp Up, a channel dedicated to anybody who wishes to become a software developer or a better software developer. In this video we'll talk about middleware in ASP.NET Core. This is a really crucial topic because you simply cannot build an ASP.NET Core application without using at least a bunch of middleware. That's why in this video we'll try to graphically define exactly what middleware is, how a middleware pipeline is supposed to work, and we'll also create our very own custom tiny middleware to see better how this middleware pipeline is supposed to perform actions on incoming requests and outgoing responses. So let's start by defining exactly how middleware is supposed to work conceptually. Let's start by trying to imagine what happens when a request comes into our web application or API. So the request will normally hit our web server, which in ASP.NET Core is usually Kestrel, the built-in web server of ASP.NET Core. Let's name this web server as point A. Now on the other side there is also a point B, which is either a controller if we're having an API and a view if we're having a normal web application. The request that comes in has to pass from point A to point B, then a response needs to be generated that needs to be again sent to point A, and then the response will leave our web server. So we can imagine that between point A and B we have a pipeline. So each request will pass through this pipeline from A to B, and each response will pass again through the same pipeline from point B to point A. Now the question would be, wouldn't it be very cool if we could have some custom piece of software lying somewhere on the way in this pipeline, and that when a request goes through the pipeline it should pass through all this piece of software in which we could perform several things. For instance, we could have such a piece of software that performs authentication and authorization. We could have another piece of software that would apply logging, will log different things. We could have another piece of software that would handle exceptions or global exceptions and so on. And really that's all what middleware is about. Middleware is a piece of software that lies on that request pipeline between point A and point B, and each request and response need to pass through all the configured middleware, so then we can apply our own custom logic on the incoming request or on the outgoing response. So we can imagine that a request would come in, it would hit our web server, then it will start to go through the pipeline, and it will hit our first middleware, which is the authentication and authorization middleware. So here is where authentication and authorization will be done. If authorization or authentication fails, then the request could be terminated here and it could be sent back to point A and then back to the client that made that request. However, if everything is okay, then the request is passed through to the next middleware in this pipeline, and in this case is logging. So this middleware may look into the headers of the request and check different information and log different things either to the debug console or to a file or a database. And when this processing is done, this logging middleware will then send the request further to the next middleware in the pipeline, which in our case would be the exception handling middleware. So if we have a problem, for instance, a request for a page that doesn't exist or an endpoint that doesn't exist, we can choose to terminate the request here and the response will be generated and sent to the client via point A. However, once again, if everything is alright, then the request would arrive to our controller or view, let's say. Then what happens here is that a response is generated. If we have an API, this might be a JSON response. If we have a web application, the response would contain an HTML page. And then the response is sent again through this middleware pipeline, and it passes all the exact same middleware, but in reverse order. So it will pass the exception middleware first, and here again, if we need to perform our logic and log some exception based on the response that we have received from point B, we can do that here. Then, of course, we could apply also logging. Authentication and authorization will be on the response probably not necessary. So the authentication middleware will simply pass the request further. So the request will arrive to the web server and it will be sent to the client, and the client would receive the awaited response. So that's a very basic explanation on how middleware is supposed to work. And because requests are passing one by one through all this important middleware in the pipeline, we can see that also, or we can assume that middleware order is really very important, because each request will pass through each middleware in this exact order, and each response will pass through the exact same middleware but in reverse order, since it starts from point B. So for instance, if we are placing the logging middleware and exception middleware before the authentication middleware, maybe we will perform some logging operations or exception throws on a request that is not authorized or authenticated, and in this case we have basically use some resources that we don't need. So that's why the authentication and authorization middleware usually is one of the first pieces of middleware that you would configure in a middleware pipeline. Let's switch back to Visual Studio to see exactly how we can implement middleware in an ASP.NET Core application. I have started a brand new ASP.NET Core API project. However, if you want to follow along, you can start an ASP.NET Core empty project or a web project. It is the same for our purpose. And we are here on the startup.cs, so on the startup class, because here is where we'll work with middleware. We have this configure services method, which we'll skip for now because we want to concentrate on this configure method. Because in this configure method, as these comments also show, is used to define middleware, so to apply custom logic to incoming requests and outgoing response. And by default, when you start a new project, you already have two middleware configured. I'm sure you already have seen this if you have played around with ASP.NET Core, but maybe you did not realize that what you see here is basically middleware. So a first middleware is app use developer exception page, which basically means that when we are running this application in a development environment, we will use always developer friendly exception pages. Then the second piece of middleware that we have is use MVC, which instructs the ASP.NET Core application to use the MVC model. So if we have controllers, then requests would be routed to our controllers and so on. However, we can customize here or configure different type of middleware. And there are some middleware pieces that are shipped directly with ASP.NET Core. And one of them is, for instance, use authentication. And this would configure a middleware that would be able to authenticate and authorize the incoming request. And as said, usually we want to perform authentication and authorization as fast as possible. So that's why this middleware will usually be here right after the use developer exception page middleware. Then we can have other type of middleware that would perform other things like use course. And this middleware is used to configure cross-origin resource sharing. Now we have here a red squiggly line because a lot of the middleware that comes in with ASP.NET Core needs to be also configured. So when we run use course, we also need to provide a configuration object and so on. But for now, we won't bother about this red squiggly line. I just wanted to show you that you could implement this type of middleware. Then another one that is very common is use static files. And we always need this middleware if we really want to serve also static files to incoming requests. And if the request is for a static file, it doesn't need to pass through all the other middleware that comes afterwards. We can just simply serve the static file that is needed. And of course we can configure exactly from where to serve the static files and so on. The main idea is, if you remember this graphical representation with point A and point B, let's assume that point A is here somewhere above. Let's say this is point A, and let's assume that point B is somewhere here after use MVC. So when a request comes in, what it will happen, it will come, we could say as example, from above, and it will hit each middleware one after the other. When the response is generated, the response will again pass through each of these configured middleware in reverse order. So it will pass through use MVC, use static files, use course, use authentication. However, when we already have the response, we usually won't perform any actions here. The main idea is that if you write your custom middleware, for instance, you can define certain actions to be performed when the request comes in, and then await the response and perform some further actions when the response is already available. However, important is to note that here in this configure method is where you configure your middleware pipeline, and the order is very important. Each request will start with the first middleware, then the second, the third, and so on, and the response will then pass through the same middleware pipeline but in reverse order. Let's now take a look at how we can configure our very small, very tiny custom middleware here, so that we can show better how middleware is supposed to work. Please note first that we have removed all previously configured middleware since we really don't need them anymore. We want to concentrate right now on our custom middleware because using our custom middleware we can also see better how the middleware pipeline can be configured. So a custom middleware can be always used using app.use. Use is a delegate on the application builder instance that will help us to perform some custom logic here on the request or on the response, and then pass it to the next middleware in the pipeline. In order to do that, we would need basically two very important things. Let's first of all make this async, everything what comes afterwards, and we would need the HTTP context and the next delegate. And I will shortly explain also why we need that. And we used a simple lambda expression in order to run some custom logic here. Now the next delegate is very important because we will use it in order to instruct the request or to send the request to the next middleware in the pipeline. And the context is the placeholder for the current HTTP context that we will have on each request. So what we'll do here is await context.response.write async, and here we will simply write something. And also let's add a p tag. This would be an HTML tag. Okay, we have also to provide here p, and then let's here run hello world. A very basic, I would say traditional hello world output. And here what we need to do is also to use the next delegate. And using this next delegate, we simply pass this request or the response to the next middleware in the pipeline. If we want to pass it to the next middleware and we are working currently on the request, it will be passed to use MVC. If we would do something on the response, then it would be passed here to use developer exception page. However, let's make some things a little bit clearer. Let's add a comment here. So this is logic to perform on request normally. And after this await.next, we would have logic to perform on response. So this is how we would normally do it. This means that this await context response write async call we should normally make here after the await next. However, for testing purposes, we want to run this here in the part where we would normally process the request, and we will see exactly also why. When we run this application, we will also get some exceptions, but we could already test how this middleware is working right now. And the application is starting. In a few seconds we'll see some output in the browser, and it is hello world as expected. So that's perfectly fine. And here are also the exception that we got because we wrote to the response before the response was even generated, let's say. Good. Let's here, however, simply copy this middleware and add it once again. And let's change here a little bit and let's make it hello from middleware 1. And here let's put hello from middleware 2. Okay, so now we should have two outputs in our browser, one from the first middleware and one from the second middleware. So let's check if this is truly the case, and in a few seconds we should be able, and indeed we have hello from middleware 1 and hello from middleware 2. So that's kind of cool. We created two custom middleware. One prints hello from middleware 1 and the second prints hello from middleware 2. But what happens if we simply delete this await next? We said that await next was basically sending the request to the next middleware in the pipeline. So let's run the application and check exactly what the behavior is. And when the application loads, we will see that the result should be a little bit different. But how different? Oh, we can see here we have only hello from middleware 1, which means that only this middleware was executed. And this means in turn that if we don't use this await next, then the request won't simply be sent further to the next middleware in the pipeline, and the response will be generated and will be returned to the client. So in this case, the second app.use was never hit because we don't have here a next. If we introduce here await next, then we would see that everything should be fine again. So we can safely say that this next delegate is very important because if we don't use it, we can short circuit the entire middleware pipeline. Now, for instance, this might be useful in some cases. For example, you have to perform some custom logic, and if certain things don't add up, you simply want to generate a response and return it to the client without passing the request to all the other middleware in the pipeline. But in most cases, when you are using app.use, you want to pass the request further to be processed. So don't forget, it's very important always if you are using this app.use to add some custom logic, your custom logic to the middleware pipeline. Don't forget to add this await.next or await next, sorry. So we have seen what middleware is, what a middleware pipeline is, how we can configure a middleware pipeline, how we can use default built-in middleware that ship together with ASP.NET Core, and finally we have created our own custom middleware one middleware to print hello from middleware 1 and the other hello from middleware 2. Finally, we have tested what happens if we simply forget to add the next delegate to app.useMiddleware, and it will simply short-circuit the pipeline. Now, since this video got fairly long, we will stop for now here, but there will be a continuation to this video, a part 2, where we'll talk about other app delegates. For now we have used only app use, but we can also use app run, and this will also short-circuit the pipeline, and we can use app map or app map when, and in that case we can configure different maps in certain circumstances. So please check again shortly to see the second video about ASP.NET Core middleware. If you find this content useful, please subscribe to Developer Ramp Up. Feel free to share this content with your friends and network also. And should you have any feedback or questions, just hit me with a comment. Also, don't forget a thumbs up. Thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.